respect for the gospel. If you're able, please rise. The gospel lesson this morning from Matthew, the 9th chapter. As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth. And he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. And as he sat at dinner in the house, many tax collectors and sinners came and were sitting with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to the disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" But when he heard this, he said, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have come to call not the righteous, but sinners." While he was saying these things to them, suddenly a leader of the synagogue came in and knelt before him, saying, "My daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her, and she will live." And Jesus got up and followed him with his disciples. Then suddenly a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years came up behind him and touched the fringe of his cloak. For she said to herself, "If only I touch his cloak, I will be made well." Jesus turned and seeing her, he said, "Take heart, daughter, your faith has made you well." And instantly the woman was made well. When Jesus came to the leader's house and saw the flute players and the crowd making a commotion, he said, "Go away, for the girl's not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. But when the crowd had been put outside, he went in and took her by the hand, and the girl got up. And the report of this spread throughout the district. Praise God for the hearing of these sacred words. Thanks be to God. You may be seated.
Within the life of the church, last week was Trinity Sunday, and we learned that we as Christians worship and we believe in a God not only of heaven, but also a God who is working here on earth. And this week we're going to continue building on that theme by talking about what does spiritual growth look like and what does spiritual transformation look like. You may have noticed that on the pulpit there's a green pyramid. Behind the cross there's a green pyramid. We have, liturgically speaking, we have entered into a season of spiritual growth. And I think in our lesson today that you just heard, what we find is a picture, a vivid picture and story about what it means for us to be transformed by the love of Christ and what it means for us to live into the gospel. As we do get started today, let's begin with a moment of prayer. Lord God, on this day I do ask that you would work in each of us in such a way that we might be present to you, even as you're here, present both in and within each of us. Lord God, on this day I pray that you would take the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts. And again, I pray that you would work in such a way that they would be made to be acceptable in your sight. For indeed, you are our rock and you are our Redeemer. Amen. There are many people in our world today who are struggling. In preparation for my sermon, I came across a study that said about 75% of the world today says that we're not moving in a positive direction. We're not moving toward a good place any longer. I came across another study that said post-2020, post-pandemic, half of adults in our country and our society today have reported a significant episode of anxiety and depression. Not only that, our kids are struggling with direction and purpose and meaning for their lives. Not only that, we live during a season in which our drug of choice seems to be uncivility or a lack of civility towards one another, and there's division. Not only that, we live during a time in which there have been more mass shootings this year than days of the year. And so the question becomes, why? Why have we entered into this season in which so many people are struggling? And let's be honest, it touches us all. Why? And the answer is, well, there's multiple different reasons, but a big part of it is, I believe we're living during a season in which we're struggling spiritually. And we need salvation. Now, I know that word salvation carries a negative connotation with us. I know. There's some of us in this room that don't want to hear that word. In fact, there's probably most of us in this room that can think of someone who have been saved or born again in a remarkably unattractive way. My hunch is you probably can think of someone, even as I say that. Yet, here's the thing. The word salvation, the word saved appears roughly 500 times in the Bible. And here's the thing. When it does appear, it's not talking about the afterlife most of the time. Instead, salvation is talking about the transformation of this world and this life. Sometimes when the word salvation is used, it's talking about a person being rescued from peril or danger. Other times when the word salvation is being used, it's talking about a group of people being liberated from oppression. But the question becomes, what does it mean to be saved today? And when the definition I'm going to throw out there to you is this. Salvation is about a healing of our relationship with God, but also a healing of our relationship with one another. And as we turn to our lesson today, again, we find a vivid picture about what that healing looks like. In Matthew chapter 9, we find the story of Jesus going first to the tax collector's booth, Matthew's booth, and he calls Matthew to, of course, come and follow him. In those days, tax collectors were not liked. I know that's probably a massive surprise to all of you all that they were not liked, but they were really not liked in those days. They were ridiculed, and the reason was because they charged unfair rates to the people. And they were viewed as people who had become traitors of their own people. And they were in collaboration with the Romans, in cahoots with the Romans, so people really didn't like them. And so Jesus walks up to Matthew's, the tax collector's booth, and invites Matthew to come follow him. And of course, Matthew gets up and follows him. And then the next scene, Jesus goes and eats in Matthew's house. And, well, people weren't happy about that because who's Jesus? Who's this man that eats with tax collectors and sinners is what the verse says. That's the first scene. In the second scene, after that's over, Jesus, it seems, is walking through the crowd. And a woman who's suffering from an issue with blood, she had struggled for 12 years with this ailment. She reaches out and she touches Jesus' robe, and immediately it says she's healed. Immediately she's made well. Jesus turns and looks at her and says, "Daughter, your faith has made you well." But a more literal translation of what Jesus says is, "Daughter, your faith has saved you." Which should tell us that the healing that she receives in this moment is much more than just physical. It's spiritual. It's also social. And finally, in the third scene, we find Jesus. He comes up on a funeral, really, and they're playing the funeral flute, it says. In those days, when someone died, that one of the ways that they mourned was that they would play a flute. They'd play funeral music, play a flute as a way of mourning. And Jesus comes upon this situation, the person had died. He raises the person from the dead, at which point the tune of the people begins to change. And they go throughout all the district, it says, and they talk about the good things that God had done through Jesus. Now, the common thread through all these passages and all these stories that we just heard today is this. Each time Jesus either approaches a person or a situation that people would have avoided, they would not have dealt with in that time. And each time he brings salvation and healing to those situations that people would have avoided and not entered into in that time. At the same time, what we find in this passage, I believe, is really an allegory, if you will, of how salvation works in our lives. How God heals our relationship with God, but also seeks to heal our relationship with one another. And the first thing that sticks out to me about our stories today, our lesson today, is this. When it comes to salvation, God comes looking for us before we go looking for God. Christ comes looking for us before we go looking for Christ. This much is seen in the story of Matthew the tax collector. The story goes, Matthew the tax collector, big surprise, he's tax collecting when Jesus comes and finds him. He's not looking for Jesus. He's not looking for Christ. He's not looking for anything like that at all. Instead, Jesus just approaches him and invites him to come follow him. Now, in the Methodist tradition, this idea that God comes looking for us before we go looking for God is called prevenient grace. We have long believed as Methodists I'm going to sound like a Methodist pastor this morning for a moment. We've long believed as Methodists that God's presence is poured out on all people. That there's a spark of God's love, and there's a spark of God's presence, and there's a spark of God's Spirit that lives in all people. And we call it prevenient grace. And I know that sounds all well and good, but here's the catch, and there's always a catch. Prevenient grace is not always rainbows and unicorns, folks. Sometimes it's really hard. When we start to first experience God's presence in our lives, sometimes it's really difficult. In fact, in the early days of Methodism, when those folks first experienced prevenient grace, I'm talking about the 17 and 1800s, when they first started experiencing prevenient grace, some of them passed out, literally in the middle of worship service. Now, if someone did that today, I know what we would do. We would call 911. What happened? This is a United Methodist Church, not the 17 and 1800s version of the church. At other times, when people experienced prevenient grace in the early days, they would literally wail in the midst of the service. They would start crying in the midst of the service because of that heaviness, that weight that came from the sense of God's presence in their life. And again, we don't act like that necessarily today. But I do think as a culture in the world, we are experiencing prevenient grace. And I think one of the big ways that we're experiencing prevenient grace as a culture today is the despair and the depression and the anxiety that so many of us are feeling as a society. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that all depression and all anxiety can be attributed to a spiritual issue. I know there's some very real medical type situations where people need therapy and therapists, and God bless the therapists and the counselors of this world. Don't get me wrong. But I do believe part of the despair of our time is that we have tuned out to the spiritual dimension of our lives. We've tuned out to that deepest place of knowing that we have, that we've tuned out to what is most real about our lives and the world around us. And as a result of that, we're experiencing some emotions and some feelings that are trying to tell us something's not right. Something's off. Something's wrong. And I believe that is, in many ways, an experience of prevenient grace, of God calling out to us. Something needs to change. So the first thing we have to understand about salvation is, well, God comes looking for us before we go looking for God, but there's a catch. It's not always rainbows and unicorns. Sometimes it's difficult. Sometimes God calls us to change. Sometimes God calls us to speak out. Sometimes God calls us to do some very difficult things, and it, more than a big loving feeling within our hearts, it feels like a burning in our souls at times. And so what's the way out? Well, it's our faith that makes us well. That's the second scene, right? In the second scene of our lesson, there's a lady that's dealing with the issue of blood, and it says that she reaches out and she grabs his robe, and immediately she's healed. And Jesus looks at her and says, "Your faith has made you well. Your faith has saved you." Literally, that's what it says, saved you. Now, this gets lost in translation, but what's important to realize is what she grabs when she grabs his robe. In the first century context, it was the part of the robe that Jewish men typically wore. It was part of the robe that represented obedience to the Torah, obedience to the commandments, obedience to what they believed God had called them to do. And I think that's a powerful symbol of what it means to have faith. Faith says, okay, I'll do it, God. Okay. I feel this change happening to me, God. Okay, I give in, God. And until we are able to do that, until we're willing to say yes to that nudge within our hearts, well, life, it feels heavy. This past week was annual conference. Now, how many Methodists do we have in this room that know what annual conference is? We got some annual conferencers? Okay, you all know. Okay, here we go. So as you know, Annual conference is a gathering of Methodists across the whole region of the church. A conference is what we call it. And a conference is presided over by a bishop. And so we're a connectional church. There are delegates from every church, every United Methodist church from all over the state of Indiana. We gather together in Muncie, Indiana. And we talk about the business of the church. We talk about our dreams for the church. We vote on resolutions for the church. In a couple weeks, I'll send you out a report of what we did at annual conference. I'm not going to go through every detail right now. But let me just be honest with you for a second when it comes to annual conference. It's not the most exciting event that one ever participated in. It's like an extended church meeting. And now, if you know me very well, you know church meetings not Pastor Andy's jam. Yet, I go because I feel like that's the right thing for me to do as United Methodist pastor. Here's the thing. My brother is also a United Methodist pastor. He likes meetings less than I do, which is miraculous in its own way that he's able to do that. And so there's the first day of annual conference, and we just went to our morning session, and then we went to lunch, and I was walking back, and I leaned over to one of my friends, and I say, I'll tell you what would be a miracle, is if my brother shows up. It wasn't like 2 minutes later, I turned the corner, to be honest with you, men's bathroom, turned the corner, and I heard my brother's voice echoing through the men's restroom, and I'm like, it's a miracle, Dan. You're here. Holy cow. And so it was good to see him, and later on that day we went out to pizza. And as we were talking and we were having pizza together with some friends, we were talking about some of the issues we were facing as a denomination. My brother and I were talking a little bit about some of the struggles our family's having right now. As you know, my family's got some challenges right now too. And then he quoted something to me. It's like a word from God. That's the best I can describe it. He says, there's this lady named Elizabeth Elliot, and this quote I've been telling myself, my brother said, that has really helped me. And here's the quote. The secret is Christ in me, not me in a different life situation. The secret of life is Christ in me, not me transported to a different life situation. Oh, so often we pray, don't we, that our situation would change, that person would change, that the world would become different. But the secret is not that our world around us would necessarily change. The secret is we tune into the Christ in us, and we do deep down what God's called us. And as we tune into that, as we say yes to that, folks, our tune begins to change. It begins to change. And that's the last scene in our lesson today. After Jesus heals the woman, it's next that he goes to the funeral. And as he goes to the funeral, they're playing the funeral music with the flute. And he, of course, raises this person from the dead. And the next thing it says is the people go out throughout all the district telling of the good things that God has done. I don't know about you. I'm tired of playing funeral music. I'm tired of looking out the world and saying, this is a dead situation. I'm tired of the negativity. I'm tired of the loss of hope. I'm tired of the despair. I'm ready, like Jesus in the story and the people in the story, to talk about the good things that God is doing. And let me just say it, God is doing some good things in the world around us. My life, your life. Extraordinary things happen when we say yes to the voice of Christ within. And one of the good things God has done in our life recently, the life of this church recently, comes from my friend Simeon. Simeon started coming to church here a few months ago. It hasn't been very long. He just showed up one Sunday morning, and we began to get to know Simeon. He came to our Sunday school class, and then it was, I will never forget, it was a Monday, Thursday service. My wife Leslie and I were standing next to Simeon, and we could hear him sing. At which point, you kind of know what's going to happen next. We said, hey, Simeon, would you sing in the praise team for us? And here's the thing he said. Thank you for asking. Thank you for asking me to participate in the life of the church. you are a wonderful group of people. This never happens. But let me just say, not everyone says thank you when you ask to help and serve in the church. Doesn't always happen that way. Sometimes people say yes and then grumble, grumble, grumble after it's over. But he was inspired by the invitation simply to sing. Never did we know the impact we were going to have on his life. I'll let him tell the story of what Methodist Temple means to him.
So Pastor Andy asked me to give my story and about what Methodist Temple has meant to me since I've been here. I've not been here a very long time, but it's been really a great journey for me so far, just in the few months that I've been here. To tell you about my story, I definitely need to go back several years. I grew up in a very religious environment. It's very conservative, and someone called it rigid, which I think is probably pretty accurate to say. I didn't know any different. I was born and raised in that environment, and that's all I ever knew. Well, when I was about 10 years old, I think that's when I realized I was gay, and that was not accepted in the environment that I grew up in. And so I grew up with a lot of fear, a lot of hiding, a lot of, asking myself what's wrong with me. And especially as I got older, I tried everything I could do, to pray the gay away, and nothing was quite working, as I'm sure you can imagine. And so trying to fight those feelings and what I felt like was right and wrong based off what I was taught growing up, and then just trying to bridge that gap between my relationship with God and my religion and my sexuality. And so there was times I never thought that would be possible. And so I just tried to do my best. Well, in my 20s or so, I officially came out, and my church at the time was accepting as they could be, but not as much as other places. And so I tried to stay for a while, and I was really involved. But there was a point where I was told I would no longer be able to sing anymore, and I really love singing in the praise team, and I feel like the best thing I can do for God is use my voice. And so that was really hurtful at the time, and I understood, and no hard feelings, but I figured that's probably not the place I need to be anymore. And so I still lived in Owensboro at the time, and I was trying different places. Well, then a little while later, I moved to Evansville, and I started looking for churches in the area. And the first thing I did was look up LGBTQ affirming churches. And I think it was USI or U of E had a list of churches, and Methodist Temple was the first one that popped up in the list. I'm like, all right, that's right down the street from me. I'll start there and see what happens. And so I started coming here, and everyone has been so lovely and kind and so sweet and genuine towards me. And in a way I didn't know it was possible. And it's just the best sort of way. Pastor Andy and his wife Leslie, they've just been so kind and welcoming to me, and then there are so many other people that have done just the same and treated me like they've known me their entire life, and so it's been so awesome. There have been other members, especially in the Sojourn Sunday school group, that have been just as welcoming and welcome open their arms to me and make me feel welcome as soon as I got here. And I think the ultimate just aha moment that made me feel so at home and so welcome and accepted here is when Leslie asked me if I would help sing in the praise team. And that meant so much to me. I don't think I could properly articulate it, because like I said, for so long I felt like I had to hide who I was and pretend to be something I wasn't. But then to come here and accepted just as I am in a safe space, and to be even celebrated for who I am, and then to ask to get to do the thing that I love to do most, it's such a wonderful moment for me. And I don't think I can ever really articulate how much Methodist Temple has meant to me. And it's been wonderful the past few months that I've been here. Unfortunately, I took a job in another state, so I won't be staying here much longer, but I consider this my home now, and if I'm ever in the area, I'll definitely be stopping here, and I'll definitely be watching online. But Methodist Temple has been a game changer for me.
So when Simeon, he moved to Stanford, actually. He just moved to Stanford in California. And I told Simeon, I said, you're lucky you didn't put me down for a reference, because I would have told the dean, he's an awful person. You don't want him. We're going to keep him here at Methodist Temple. But the two things that stuck out to me about his story. First, this is home. This is home. Second, he noted he could not put into words the healing that came, because we just welcomed him and loved him. Folks, this is a story of salvation. It's a story of salvation. First, there's the story of Simeon, who experienced salvation within himself. For the longest time, he hid who he truly was. And then when he came out and he told the truth about who he truly was, the people who called themselves Christian did not welcome him. But he didn't stop listening to that voice, fortunately, and he kept looking until he found a community where he could practice his faith. That's a story of salvation. And in my opinion, that's a story of listening to the voice of Christ within him. The second part of the story, though, is, I'm biased here, my wife Leslie, who heard him sing. She didn't see a gay man that night. What she saw was a child of God. And she heard someone that could sing. And we just asked him to participate. And it was through that act of seeing Christ and the gift in another person that healing came. You see, salvation is a two-way street, folks. It begins with us willing to hear the voice of God, the voice of love within us, but it changes the way we see one another. We see one another for who we truly are. We're children of God. And that's Jesus' secret in our lesson today. Jesus' secret when he goes to Matthew, the tax collector's booth, is he doesn't see Matthew, the tax collector. He sees a brother, a child of God. When Jesus sees this woman that has the issue of blood, he doesn't see a person with an issue of blood. In those days, a person with that issue, they would have been told that God has left you. God's not with you. That's what they told this lady in that story. But Jesus didn't see that. He saw a daughter of God. In fact, that's what it says. He says daughter. That's what he says in the lesson. And finally, in the last scene, Jesus doesn't see a situation, a dead situation in that last scene. Instead, he sees an opportunity to be the light of God's presence in the world. And that's the calling upon our lives too. Salvation is not about getting teleported to another world. It's about being transformed in this world. It's about listening to the voice of a loving God that's speaking within us. And it's about choosing to see other people through that same lens. Yesterday, as annual conference left, I had a young pastor come up to me. And he said, Andy, you've been at this a while. And I thought, wow, that really snuck up on me. I didn't think that people thought of me that way. I thought I was young clergy. Apparently not. He said, Andy, you've been at this a while. What's your secret? How did you create a community like this? And I said, well, I didn't. God did. I guess if I had one secret, it would be this. Begin with the love of God which lives within every person and treat them accordingly. See Christ in every person and treat them accordingly. When that happens, wonderful things take place in the world. And so my question for you there today is this. What's Christ calling you to do? What's Christ calling you to say? What's the deep, burning desire within your heart? This much I can tell you is if we listen to that voice, not only as individuals, but also a community, we begin to sing a new song in a world that, well, desperately needs to hear it. Our closing song this morning is perfect. It's called Homecoming. I'm going to invite the praise team to come and let us sing about our home we have here at Methodist Temple, but more importantly today as we sing, let us sing about our home that we have in God's love and God's presence on this day. Would you stand and let us sing?